The train groans to a halt, its sigh of steam and metal a final, weary exhalation. Alara grips her small, worn valise, her knuckles white. Through the grimy window, the town of Redemption appears as little more than a smudge of brown buildings against an endless, bleached blue sky. Dust devils dance in the street, indifferent. This is it. The end of a 1,000-mile journey, and perhaps, the end of hope itself. She sees him standing on the platform, a silhouette against the harsh sun. He is taller than his letter suggested, broader in the shoulder. His hat is pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He is alone. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. Alara takes a breath that feels like swallowing sand. She is prepared for the look. The flicker of disappointment, the thinly veiled assessment that finds her lacking. She has seen it her entire life. In the eyes of the matrons at the orphanage, in the faces of the men who passed her over for prettier, more vivacious girls. Her letter had been honest, painfully so, plain of face and quiet of nature. A diligent worker, seeking a respectable life. His reply had been just as stark. Need a wife. Have a ranch. We'll provide. Silas Croft. No poetry, no promises. A simple transaction. Now, the goods are here for inspection. She braces for the scorn, for the quiet refusal that will leave her stranded in this godforsaken place with $3 to her name. He takes a step forward as she descends to the platform, and for a terrifying moment, she sees him fully. His face is weathered, carved by sun and wind, his eyes a startling, clear gray. They hold no warmth, but no cruelty either. Just a deep, unnerving stillness. The station master gives her a pitying glance. A woman from the mercantile across the way whispers behind her hand to a companion, their shared look a sting of humiliation. Alara's shoulders slump, but Silas Croft does not turn away. He walks directly to her, stops, and simply looks at her, his gaze taking in her travel-worn dress and the fear in her eyes. Then, he does something she never expected. He reaches out a calloused, steady hand. He doesn't offer to take her bag. He offers her his hand. Tentatively, she places her trembling fingers in his palm. His grip is firm, secure. He gives a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not to her, but to the whispering town itself. He looks back down at her, and his voice, when it comes, is low and rough, like stones grinding together. You're home now. The wagon ride was a study in silence. It wasn't an angry silence, not the kind she had known in the orphanage when punishment was being meted out. This was a vast, yawning silence, as wide and empty as the landscape that unspooled around them. Silas Croft handled the reins with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon where the jagged teeth of the mountains bit into the sky. Alara sat ramrod straight on the hard wooden bench, her valise clutched in her lap like a shield. She stole glances at him from beneath the brim of her bonnet. He was not a handsome man, not in the way the heroes of her few, treasured books were described. His jaw was square and stubborn, his nose looked as if it had been broken at least once, and a faint white scar cut through one eyebrow. But there was a solidity to him, a rootedness, like an old, weathered oak that had withstood 100 storms. He had said, "You're home now," and the words had struck her with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Home had been a cold bed in a long dormitory, a shared plate, a life lived at the sufferance of others. The word itself was a foreign country. She had answered his advertisement out of sheer, bone-deep desperation. Her last position as a laundress had ended when the family's son had taken an unwelcome interest in her, and his mother, rather than scolding the boy, had dismissed Alara with a lecture on modesty. She was 24, and the world had made it clear there was no respectable place for a plain, penniless orphan. Silas Croft's letter, with its blunt lack of illusion, had seemed like the only plank in a churning sea. He hadn't asked for a photograph, an omission for which she was profoundly grateful. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, he finally spoke, his voice startling her. "Not much to look at," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the valley ahead. "But the soil's good." Nestled in a shallow basin was a small, unpainted cabin with a stone chimney. A modest barn stood nearby, its wood bleached silver by the sun. A few chickens pecked in the dirt, and a lone horse watched their approach from a small corral. It was spare. It was isolated. It was the quietest place she had ever seen. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the cabin's porch and looped the reins around the brake handle. He swung down with a lithe grace that surprised her, then turned and looked up at her. For a moment, she thought he would leave her to manage on her own, but he reached up. "Give me your hand." His palms were rough against hers, the calluses like worn leather. He lifted her down as if she weighed nothing, his grip steadying her on the uneven ground. The gesture was practical, nothing more, yet it sent a strange warmth through her. He released her, retrieved her valise, and led the way inside. The cabin was one room. A stone hearth dominated one wall, swept clean. A sturdy table with 2 chairs sat in the center. A cast-iron stove stood in a corner, and shelves holding a few tins and sacks of flour lined the wall beside it. At the far end was a bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt. On the opposite side, a narrow cot was folded against the wall. It was impeccably clean, the floorboards scrubbed pale, but it was the home of a man who lived without frills or comforts. It was the home of a man who was alone. "The bed is yours," he said, placing her valise beside it. His tone brooked no argument. "I'll take the cot. Water's in the barrel by the door. Pump is out back. I'll see to the team." And with that, he was gone, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, the silence rushing back in to fill the space he had vacated. Alara walked slowly to the bed and touched the quilt. It was old, the colors faded, but the stitching was small and neat. A woman's work. His mother's, perhaps. She looked around the sparse room that was to be her life. It wasn't a home. Not yet. It was a shelter. But as she sank onto the edge of the mattress, the exhaustion of her long journey washing over her, she remembered the feel of his hand closing around hers, the simple, declarative power of his words. For the first time, the terror that had been her constant companion for weeks began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative flicker of something she dared not name. The first days passed in a haze of awkward adjustment. They moved around each other like wary animals, careful not to breach the invisible boundaries that defined their strange arrangement. Silas rose before dawn, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. By the time Alara emerged from behind the privacy screen he had fashioned for her out of a spare blanket, he was already out, tending to his horse and the small herd of cattle that represented his entire fortune. She learned his rhythms quickly. He worked from sunup to sundown, a relentless, driving energy in everything he did. He was mending fences, clearing rocks from a new patch of ground he hoped to plant, reinforcing the barn roof against the coming winter. He ate what she put in front of him without comment, his hunger a testament to his labor. He never praised her cooking, but he always cleaned his plate, a form of compliment she came to understand. Alara, for her part, threw herself into making the cabin a home. She scrubbed and swept, washed their clothes in a large tub out back, and discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the house. She spent hours on her knees, pulling weeds with a fierce determination, coaxing life back into the parched soil. It was hard, back-breaking work, but it was hers. For the first time, she was not working for a meager wage or to earn her keep under a resentful roof. She was building something. Their conversations were brief and functional. "Need more flour from town. The black hen is laying again, storms coming from the west." Yet, in the quiet spaces between the words, a different language began to form. It was in the way he left a bucket of fresh water for her on the porch every morning so she wouldn't have to work the stiff pump handle. It was in the way she mended a tear in his work shirt, her stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. It was in the shared glance across the dinner table when a coyote howled in the distance, a fleeting moment of mutual acknowledgement of their shared isolation. A week after her arrival, he announced they needed to go to town for supplies. A knot of anxiety tightened in Alara's stomach. She had not forgotten the whispers at the train station, the cold, appraising stares. She had been safe here in their secluded valley, insulated from the judgment of the world. Now she had to face it again. She put on her best dress, the same sober gray she had arrived in, and tied her bonnet securely under her chin. When she stepped out of the cabin, Silas was waiting with the wagon. He looked at her, his usual unreadable expression firmly in place, but she saw his eyes flick over her for a moment longer than usual. He simply nodded and helped her up onto the seat. Redemption was just as dusty and grim as she remembered. As they drove down the main street, she felt the eyes on them. Curtains twitched in windows. Men standing outside the saloon paused their conversations to watch them pass. Alara kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The mercantile was run by a portly man named Mr. Gable, whose smile didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. His wife, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, stood behind the counter, her arms crossed. She was the one Alara had seen whispering at the station. "Croft," Mr. Gable said, his tone professionally pleasant but lacking any real warmth. "And the missus?" The question hung in the air, heavy with insinuation. "My wife, Alara," Silas stated flatly. He handed Gable a list. "We need these things." While Mr. Gable gathered the items, his wife, Beatrice, subjected Alara to a thorough, head-to-toe inspection. Her gaze lingered on Alara's plain dress and work-roughened hands. "I suppose it's hard for a man alone out there," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, loud enough for the other two customers in the store to hear. "A man can get desperate, forced to take what he can get." The insult was as sharp and clean as a knife wound. Heat flooded Alara's cheeks, and she felt herself shrink, the old, familiar shame washing over her. She wanted to disappear, to run back to the safety of the cabin and never leave. Before she could react, Silas was there. He hadn't moved from his spot by the counter, but his presence seemed to fill the room. He didn't look at Mrs. Gable. He simply placed the sacks of flour and sugar on the counter and met Mr. Gable's eyes. His voice was dangerously quiet. "The price, Gable." Mr. Gable, flustered by his wife's audacity and the cold fury emanating from Silas, quickly tallied the bill. Silas paid in coin, his movements precise and deliberate. He picked up the heavy sacks as if they were nothing. "Alara," he said, his voice back to its normal, rough timbre. It was a command. She turned, her eyes on the floor, and walked toward the door. As she passed him, his hand came out and rested for a second on the small of her back, a brief, protective touch that sent a jolt through her. It was a gesture that said, "I am with you." They walked out into the blinding sunlight, leaving a shocked silence behind them. They loaded the wagon without a word and started the long journey back. Alara's heart was hammering against her ribs. She was mortified, ashamed, and furious all at once. But underneath it all, something else was stirring. In the face of public scorn, Silas Croft had not flinched. He had not apologized or made excuses. He had called her his wife and stood by her. He had shielded her. As the ranch came into view, the familiar shapes of the cabin and barn a welcome sight, she finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." He glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "For what?" "For what she said. For causing you embarrassment." Silas pulled the wagon to a stop. He turned on the seat to face her, his gray eyes searching her face. "The only one who should be embarrassed is Beatrice Gable. What she thinks means less than nothing to me. Do you understand?" She could only nod, a lump forming in her throat. He held her gaze for a moment longer. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Alara." He clicked his tongue, and the horses moved on. The rest of the way, the silence was different again. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of his unexpected defense, his quiet declaration of loyalty. And Alara realized that the small, fragile feeling she'd been harboring had begun to put down roots. In the hard, unforgiving soil of this man's world, she was beginning to feel the first stirrings of what it meant to be home. Life settled into a new pattern, one built on the foundation of that day in town. The us against the world feeling had solidified their unspoken partnership. Alara no longer felt like a hired hand or a mail-order purchase. She felt like a part of the ranch, her contributions as vital as his. She took over the household accounts, her neat ledger tracking every penny spent and earned with a frugality born of a lifetime of having nothing. She discovered a talent for preserving, and soon the shelves in the small root cellar he'd dug were lined with jars of pickled beans, spiced crab apples, and tomato relish. Silas watched it all with his usual quiet intensity. He never offered effusive praise, but one evening, after a particularly good stew she'd made with vegetables from her garden, he pushed his chair back from the table and said, My mother would have liked you. You have a good hand with things. Coming from Silas, it was the highest of compliments, and it warmed Alara more than the hearth fire ever could. She began to see past his gruff exterior to the man beneath. She saw the way he was gentle with his horse, murmuring to it as he brushed its coat. She saw the worry etched around his eyes when the creek ran low, and the quiet satisfaction on his face when he looked over his small, healthy herd. He was a man locked in a constant, solitary battle with the land, and she realized how profound his loneliness must have been before she arrived. One afternoon, while she was airing out the bedding, a small, leather-bound book fell from his pillow. It was a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, its pages worn soft with use. It was so at odds with the practical, no-nonsense man she knew that she couldn't help but open it. A passage was faintly underlined. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. She heard his footsteps on the porch and quickly tucked the book back where she'd found it, her heart racing. That night, as she lay in her bed listening to the sound of his steady breathing from across the room, she thought about those words. He had accepted her, plain and quiet as she was, without trying to change her. He had stood up for her when she was scorned. Was it possible that this man, who spoke so little, harbored such deep thoughts? Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a rider. Alara was feeding the chickens when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It was a neighbor, a man named Finch, whose property bordered Silas's to the east. Finch was a large, brutish man with a reputation for a cruel streak and a sneering contempt for anyone he deemed lesser than himself, which included the struggling Silas Croft. He reined his horse in near the corral where Silas was repairing a rail. Finch didn't dismount. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, his eyes sweeping over the small ranch with open disdain before they landed on Alara. A slow, unpleasant grin spread across his face. "Well now, Croft," he boomed, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Heard you went and bought yourself some company. Didn't figure you for the type to pay for it." Silas didn't look up from his work. He set a new nail and hammered it in with 3 clean, powerful strokes. "What do you want, Finch?" "Just being neighborly," Finch sneered, his gaze still fixed on Alara, making her skin crawl. Wondering what a piece like that costs a man these days. Does she do windows, too? The hammer in Silas's hand went still. He straightened up slowly, deliberately, and turned to face Finch. He didn't look angry. He looked preternaturally calm, which was somehow far more frightening. His hand drifted down, not touching, but hovering near the worn handle of the Colt revolver on his hip. "You're on my land, Finch," Silas said, his voice level and dangerously soft. "You'll show respect to my wife, and then you'll leave." Finch's grin faltered. He was a big man, but there was something in Silas's stance, a granite stillness, that gave him pause. He looked from Silas's cold eyes to his ready hand and back again. He scoffed, trying to regain his bluster. "No need to get touchy. Just making conversation." "The conversation is over," Silas said. "Right on." For a long moment, the two men locked gazes in a silent battle of wills. The only sounds were the cawing of a distant raven and the nervous clucking of the chickens. Finally, Finch broke. He jerked on his reins, turning his horse with more force than necessary. "Have it your way, Croft," he spat, and galloped off, leaving a trail of dust and ill will behind him. Silas watched him go, his body rigid until Finch was a small speck in the distance. Only then did he seem to relax. He let out a long breath and turned, his eyes finding Alara where she stood frozen by the coop. Their gazes met across the yard, and in that look, 1,000 things were exchanged. She saw his fierce protectiveness, the line he had drawn in the sand. He saw her fear, but also the dawning of a profound and overwhelming gratitude. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. "He won't bother you again." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tight. He just nodded, his jaw tight. He looked as if he wanted to say more, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached out and, with a surprising gentleness, tucked a stray strand of hair that had escaped her bun back behind her ear. His fingers brushed her temple, a fleeting touch of warmth and calloused skin. It was the most intimate gesture that had ever passed between them, and it left her breathless. He dropped his hand, turned, and went back to his fence as if nothing had happened, leaving Alara to stand in the sunlight, her heart thudding a wild, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. The ranch no longer felt merely safe. It felt sacred, a place defended by the quiet strength of this unlikely man. And she knew, with a certainty that frightened and thrilled her, that she was no longer just staying. She was home. The seasons began to turn. The relentless heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The rhythms of the ranch became the rhythms of their life. They worked side by side, harvesting the last of the vegetables from her garden, reinforcing the cabin against the coming cold, and salting meat for the winter. The silences between them were now comfortable, filled with the easy companionship of shared purpose. Alara found herself watching him more and more, noticing the small things. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when one of the barn cats did something amusing. The quiet pride in his voice when he spoke of his father, who had built the cabin with his own 2 hands. He started talking more, not in long speeches, but in small offerings about his life, his land, his hopes for the herd. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own past, the bleak stories from the orphanage losing some of their power in the telling, softened by his quiet, non-judgmental listening. One evening, a fierce autumn storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and rain began to lash against the cabin in near horizontal sheets. Silas stood on the porch, staring out into the maelstrom, his face grim. "The creek," he said, his voice tight. "If it rises too fast, the lower pasture will flood. The sheep are down there." The half-dozen sheep were a new venture, a gamble he'd taken with his meager savings, hoping the wool would bring an extra income. Losing them would be a devastating blow. "We have to move them," he said, already pulling on his oilskin coat. "I'm coming with you," Alara said, tying her bonnet on tight and grabbing a thick wool shawl. "No, it's too dangerous. Those sheep are my winter coat," she retorted, a spark of defiance in her eyes he'd never seen before. "I'm coming." He looked at her for a moment, saw the iron will in her jaw, and gave a short nod. "Stay close." The world outside the cabin was a churning chaos of wind and water. The rain was so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. They fought their way toward the lower pasture, the mud sucking at their boots. The creek, normally a placid ribbon of water, had become a raging, brown torrent, already spilling its banks. The terrified sheep were huddled on a small patch of high ground that was rapidly shrinking. Working together, they managed to herd the panicked animals toward the barn, their shouts lost in the roar of the storm. A young ewe, terrified, broke from the group and scrambled toward the rising water. Without a thought, Alara plunged after it, grabbing a fistful of wet wool and dragging the struggling animal back toward safety. By the time they got the last sheep into the barn and barred the door, they were both soaked to the bone, shivering and exhausted. They stumbled back into the cabin, the warmth of the fire a shocking relief. Silas helped her out of her wet shawl and pushed her toward the hearth. "Get those wet things off before you catch your death," he ordered, his voice rough with concern. He disappeared behind the privacy screen with a change of clothes, and she quickly did the same, pulling on a dry nightgown and wrapping herself in the patchwork quilt from her bed. When he emerged, he was in dry trousers and a shirt, his hair slicked back with rain. He stoked the fire until it roared, then handed her a tin mug of coffee laced with a bit of whiskey from a bottle he kept for medicinal purposes. The fiery liquid warmed her from the inside out. They sat on the floor before the fire, not speaking, listening to the storm rage outside. The shared danger had stripped away their last reserves, leaving them raw and vulnerable. "You were brave tonight," he said, his voice quiet. "I was scared," she admitted, staring into the flames. "Being scared and doing it anyway. That's what brave is." He paused. "Thank you, Alara. I'd have lost them without you." The quiet sincerity in his voice undid her. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She finally looked at him, her heart in her eyes. "No one has ever called me brave before." She told him everything then, about the endless gray days of the orphanage, the constant feeling of being less than, of being invisible. She spoke of the whispers that followed her, the casual cruelty, the crushing loneliness. "I didn't come west looking for love or a grand adventure," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I just wanted a place to be, where I wasn't a burden." Silas listened, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. When she finished, the only sound was the crackling of the logs and the drumming of the rain on the roof. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pull the quilt more securely around her shoulders. "This is your place, Alara," he said, his voice low and certain. "If you'll have it." It wasn't a question of her earning her keep. It was an offering, a statement of fact. She looked at him, at his strong, weathered face, his clear gray eyes that saw her, truly saw her, and she knew he meant it. In that moment, something shifted between them, a final wall crumbling to dust. This wasn't a transaction anymore. This was a partnership. This was two lonely people who had found an anchor in each other in the middle of a storm. As the weather cleared, news arrived in Redemption via a traveling merchant. The circuit preacher, Reverend Miller, would be arriving in 2 weeks to conduct services, baptisms, and weddings. For most, it was a cause for celebration. For Alara, it was a source of quiet dread. Their arrangement, while solid and real to them on the ranch, had no official standing. They were not legally married. The news galvanized the more pious and meddlesome elements of the town, led by Beatrice Gable. Whispers grew into a low murmur of disapproval. It was one thing for the strange, solitary Silas Croft to take in a mail-order woman. It was quite another for them to live together in sin under the town's nose. Mrs. Gable saw the preacher's visit as a divine opportunity to force the issue, to publicly expose their shameful arrangement and put Silas Croft and his plain, quiet woman in their place. Silas heard the rumors on his next trip to town. He returned to the ranch with his jaw set in a hard line. He didn't speak of it all through dinner, but Alara could feel the tension radiating from him. Finally, as she was clearing the table, he spoke. "The preacher is coming." "I know," she said softly. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. "The town's talking. Mrs. Gable is leading the charge." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with a protective anger. "They have no right." "What will we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He was silent for a long time. She could see the conflict in him. He was a proud, private man who hated the idea of his life being subject to the judgment of others. He could ignore them, but that would leave her vulnerable to their scorn, forever branded as a fallen woman. He walked back to the table and took her hands in his. His touch was firm, grounding. "We will go to the service," he said, his voice resolute. "And we will ask Reverend Miller to marry us. Properly. In front of all of them." Alara's breath hitched. "A real marriage. Vows. A ring." "Are you sure?" she whispered. "You don't have to do this for me. I can bear their talk." "This isn't just for you, Alara," he said, his gaze intense. "This is for me. This is for us." He squeezed her hands. "They want to judge us? Let them. Let them watch as I make you my wife. Let them see that what we have built here is more real and more decent than any of their bitter gossip." It was the longest, most passionate speech he had ever made. It was a declaration of war on the town's prejudice, and a profound declaration of his commitment to her. In his eyes, she saw not pity or duty, but a fierce, unwavering loyalty. A choice. He was choosing her, openly and defiantly. And in that moment, Alara knew she would stand by his side and face down the entire world. The day of the preacher's service dawned bright and clear, a crisp autumn day that felt like a mockery of the turmoil in Alara's heart. She dressed in her simple gray dress, but this time she took extra care, pinning her hair up neatly and fastening a small, tarnished silver brooch, her only possession from her mother, at her collar. When she stepped out of the cabin, Silas was waiting. He had on a clean shirt and a string tie, looking uncomfortable but resolute. He held out his hand to her, and she took it, their fingers lacing together. They didn't let go for the entire ride to town. The small wooden church was already full when they arrived. As they stepped through the door, a hush fell over the congregation. Every eye turned to them. Alara could feel the weight of their stares, a physical pressure. She saw Beatrice Gable sitting in the front pew, flanked by her cronies, a smug, triumphant look on her face. Alara's courage faltered, and her steps slowed. She felt Silas's hand tighten around hers, a silent message of strength. He led them to an empty pew near the back and sat down, pulling her down beside him, his shoulder pressed firmly against hers. Reverend Miller was an older man with kind eyes and a voice that was more gentle than booming. His sermon was on the subject of charity and the dangers of casting the first stone. Alara felt he was looking directly at them more than once, and she saw Mrs. Gable shift uncomfortably in her seat. When the service concluded, the moment of reckoning arrived. Before anyone could move, Beatrice Gable stood up, her voice sharp and carrying through the quiet church. "Reverend," she called out, a look of pious concern on her face. "Before we depart, I believe there is a matter of moral urgency in our community that requires your guidance." She turned, her eyes fixing on Silas and Alara with righteous fire. "The living arrangement of Mr. Croft and this woman. It is a flagrant disregard for decency and a stain on our town." A shocked murmur went through the crowd. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to sink through the floorboards. This was it, the public shaming she had dreaded. But then Silas stood up, pulling her to her feet with him. He did not look at Mrs. Gable. He addressed the preacher, his voice calm and clear, ringing with an authority no one in that town had ever heard from him before. "Reverend Miller," he said, "my wife and I came here today for 2 reasons. To hear you preach, and to ask you to sanctify our marriage before God and this town." The collective gasp in the church was audible. Beatrice Gable's jaw dropped, her victory snatched away in an instant. Silas turned to Alara, his gray eyes soft and full of a feeling that made her heart ache. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, thin gold band. It was his mother's. He had spent the previous night polishing it. "He's lying," Mrs. Gable sputtered. "They're not married. She's a mail-order convenience." Reverend Miller held up a hand for silence. He looked at Silas, then at Alara. He saw the worn ring. He saw the way they stood together, a united front against the hostility of the room. He saw the truth in their eyes. "Silence, Mrs. Gable," the Reverend said, his gentle voice now holding a stern edge. "The Lord is the only judge of what is in a person's heart. I see 2 people who have clearly found solace in one another." He smiled at Silas. "I would be honored to officiate." Before the stunned congregation, Silas and Alara stood before the preacher. He took her hand, his touch steady and sure, and slid the worn gold band onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. When the preacher asked him to say his vows, Silas didn't recite the traditional words. He looked directly into Alara's eyes, his voice thick with emotion. "I was alone," he said, his voice for her and her alone. "You came and made this house a home. You are strong and kind and brave. I choose you, Alara, today and all our days." Tears streamed freely down Alara's face as she repeated her own vows, her voice trembling but clear. When the preacher finally said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," the silence in the church was absolute. Then, Alara found a strength she never knew she possessed. She turned, her hand held tightly in her husband's, and faced the congregation. She looked directly at a stunned Beatrice Gable. "I am Mrs. Silas Croft," she said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. "And I have found more charity and Christian kindness in this one good man than I have in this entire town. We will trouble you no further." Without another word, they turned and walked down the aisle, their heads held high. They didn't look back. They walked out of the church and into the bright, clean sunlight, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them, sealed in the darkness. They had faced their accusers and had not been found wanting. They had forged their bond not in secrecy, but in the crucible of public opinion, and had emerged stronger, truer, and irrevocably united. The wagon ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than any they had shared before. It was a silence of peace, of deep and settled contentment. The tension of the past weeks had broken, washed away by the simple, powerful words they had spoken to each other in the church. When they crested the final hill and the valley came into view, the small cabin and barn looked different to Alara. It was no longer just a shelter or a workplace. It glowed in the afternoon sun, a sanctuary they had built and defended together. It was unequivocally home. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop by the porch and, as he always did, swung down and turned to help her. He lifted her down, but this time, when her feet were on the ground, he didn't let go. He kept her hands in his thumbs gently stroking her knuckles. The gold of his mother's ring felt warm against her skin. He looked down at her, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth, making his weathered face seem younger. The clear gray eyes that had once been so unnervingly still were now filled with a deep, quiet warmth that was meant only for her. "Mrs. Croft," he said, testing the name on his tongue. "Mr. Croft," she replied, a shy smile gracing her own lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He led her to the porch steps, and they sat, their shoulders touching, watching as the sun began its slow descent, painting the rugged mountains in hues of rose and gold. The harsh landscape that had once seemed so intimidating now looked beautiful, peaceful, a world of their own. He put his arm around her, drawing her close against his side. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the rough fabric of his shirt familiar and comforting. The long journey, the fear, the humiliation, it all felt like a story that had happened to someone else, a lifetime ago. All that mattered was the solid feel of her husband beside her, the simple gold band on her finger, and the vast, quiet peace of the valley they called their own. He turned his head slightly, his lips brushing against her hair. "You're home now, Alara," he murmured again. The words were the same ones he had spoken that first day on a dusty train platform. But now, they were not a promise of shelter or a declaration to the world. They were a simple statement of a profound and unshakable truth, whispered from his heart to hers. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of pine and clean air and the man beside her, and knew that her journey was finally, truly, over. She is home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.